I remember a sergeant I served under who kept a calendar of petty grievances. Miss a roll call and you'd find your name on the little chart he'd pinned to the wall, circled in red with a tally of infractions beside it. He took pride in turning the smallest lapse into a spectacle, shouted reprimands in the smoke pit, orders barked across a chow line so everyone could see the embarrassment. Once, over a misplaced cleaning rag, he had an entire squad stand in the rain with webbed belts tightened until our shoulders ached. He called it discipline. We called it theater. That memory isn't indulgent nostalgia, it's a key. It teaches a simple, dangerous truth. When someone with authority treats punishment as a personal instrument, an ego device, a way to command awe rather than cultivate competence, damage spreads faster than you think. Loyalty crumbles under a regimen of humiliation. Pride corrodes into fear. Men stop trusting their leaders, and a ship that ought to move as one begins to creak, then snap. If you think you've seen bad leadership, stay with me. The story I'm about to tell is one of escalation, of petty cruelty becoming catastrophic. The title isn't melodrama. The shocking truth of how this captain betrayed his crew, it's literal and moral. In the late 18th century, a Royal Navy captain, elevated by favor and kept in command by a system that prized obedience above judgment, drove his ship into a state of such terror and resentment that the crew chose an answer no civilized force should condone. The betrayal was not only personal, it was institutional. How did things come to that? Start with context and a face, Captain Hugh Piggott. The Atlantic of the 1790s was a churning theater. Revolution in France had upended alliances. Merchant traffic and naval convoys carved dangerous routes through the Caribbean, where privateers, hurricanes, and political heat made every voyage a negotiation between skill and fortune. The Royal Navy was stretched thin. Its officers rotated rapidly. Its men sometimes pressed into service with little expectation of mercy. In that climate, command mattered more than ever. A good captain could steady a ship through chaos. A bad one could turn the discipline that held a crew together into a weapon. HMS Hermione was a frigate, a sleek instrument of war, assigned to patrol and convoy duties in those troubled waters. She should have been a place where drills, seamanship, and a harsh but steady hand kept danger at bay. Instead, under Captain Hugh Piggott, Hermione became an atmosphere, stifling, humiliating, volatile. Piggott's rise was not the slow, meritocratic ascent naval idealists like to praise. His career owed much to connections. Nepotism fast-tracked him into positions others had to sweat decades for. That same system, which could lift a man into trust without the tempering of lived experience, also left him untested in the ways that matter: how to balance firmness with fairness, authority with sympathy.
He had a reputation for severity. Stories from his earlier commands included collisions at sea, narrow misses, and embarrassed captains' reports that suggested a mixture of incompetence and a brittle temperament that bristled at admitting fault. Promoted quickly, Piggott took the helm of Hermione with a zero-tolerance approach to infractions. Discipline, to him, was literal: lash, humiliation, public correction. Tradition and regulation allowed the lash. They did not require the artistry of tempering punishment with mercy. Piggott, it would later be counted, presided over an extraordinary number of floggings, reportedly 85 during his period of command. Numbers like that are not mere statistics. Each tally is a man whose back was struck, whose body bore a punishment meant to enforce order, but whose spirit could be broken in ways no ledger tracks. And the punishments were not evenly applied. Favoritism crept into the ship's culture. Men close to Piggott, those who laughed the right laugh, who found ways to win his eye, were seldom the target of his wrath. Others, for reasons often as petty as a perceived insolence, found themselves in the braces of public shaming. That partiality transformed discipline into terror. You never knew whether a misstep would be corrected or weaponized. There were specific episodes that set the tone. On one occasion, Piggott ordered the flogging of a man while another lieutenant pleaded for moderation. Contemporary accounts say Piggott disliked counsel that questioned his will. There was the Mercury incident, an international embarrassment where a collision in port and the subsequent handling of responsibility created a scandal that reached beyond Hermione's decks. Piggott punished not only through lashings, but by humiliations: the public demotion of a promising officer, the shaving of heads, the stripping of the small honors that sustained morale. Reputation mattered for a midshipman. Piggott stripped it away for reasons that appear petty when viewed across time. One victim whose name endures is David O'Brien Casey. A midshipman who later rose to lieutenant, Casey was respected by many aboard as competent and steady. He crossed Piggott's line in ways I will not pretend to fully understand. Motives mixed, recollections contested, but what followed was a public flogging and demotion that humiliated him among peers. Casey later recorded in his journal that the punishment left him deeply humiliated and bitterly convinced that the captain had acted from personal dislike rather than from any fair estimation of his conduct. That passage, brief and repeated by historians, gives us a human measure. The discipline was not abstract. It bruised pride and morale in a way that trained men to resent, not to reform. Pigot's pattern extended to the lower ranks.
Sailors like Michael Sheehy, whose name appears in contemporary records, suffered repeated floggings, a punishment meted out for infractions that to us now might seem minor, and which to the crew felt arbitrary. Repetition breeds despair. It also breeds stories. Rumors on a ship are like tinder. Set them against a captain who relishes punishment, and they flare into conspiracy and dread. Men whispered about Pigot's favorites, about the severity meted out to a hard-working sailor for a small mistake, about the way officers who dared to intercede were coldly rebuked. The ship's rhythm shifted from the sound of rigging and orders to a deeper undercurrent: watchfulness, fear, the need to protect oneself from caprice. In a command culture that prizes obedience, the very fabric that holds a crew together, mutual trust, the sense that a captain will value their lives, was being eroded. On Hermione, the erosion was not gradual alone. It was punctuated by incidents that could be seen as little betrayals, each amplifying the last. One of those betrayals involved a storm and 3 top men. It was September 20, 1797, date given in several contemporary accounts, when Hermione encountered a sudden squall that tossed the ship. The top men, those who worked aloft in the yards and rigging, were performing a dangerous, skilled role, often at the mercy of wind and rope. During that squall, the order was given to come down from aloft. According to survivors' accounts, Captain Pigot, notoriously impatient and inflexible, threatened punishment for any man who delayed. He reportedly said he would flog the last man down. That kind of command, a threat of physical humiliation wrapped in the immediacy of danger, is an inversion of every naval instinct. It asks a man to prioritize fear of the lash over the most basic self-preservation. 3 top men, whether struck by wind, stunned by sudden movement, or making a miscalculation in the chaotic dark, fell from the rigging. The severity of their injuries is recorded without lurid detail. They died. The important and chilling part is what followed. Pigot's reaction, as asked for by the crew and later chronicled, was not marked by a command to bring aid or by a visible sign of grief. He ordered the bodies to be thrown overboard. Throwing the dead to sea is, in naval terms, often a practical necessity, but the manner and timing matter. The crew viewed the order as cold and punitive in spirit, as if the captain chose not merely to dispose of bodies along a customary route, but to send a message. Lives under his command were instruments of discipline, disposable if they interfered with his sense of order. To watch 3 of your shipmates die, and then see their bodies pitched into the water with a captain's shrug, is to be told in the starkest terms where you rank. You can imagine the decks at that moment. The ropes whipped in the wind. Men soaked with spray looked at one another, trying to register grief and contagion of fear at once.
The smell of tar, the tick of rigging, the routine commands were all there, but underneath, a rising pressure that had been building under Pigot. Years of lashings, of favoritism, of public humiliation became tangible. Betrayal is not only the breaking of faith. Sometimes it's the unmistakable demonstration that the person entrusted to tend you values his authority more than your life. If you read the accounts straight, the squall incident is a fault line. It's what the crew later pointed to as the moment when resentment hardened into something like collective intent. That does not erase responsibility for what followed, nor does it justify illegal violence. But it explains how a sequence of petty cruelties and abuses of power can aggregate into a situation where men feel cornered and look for relief by whatever means they deem available. Sailors are, by training and temperament, disciplined men. Breaking a formation requires more than a hard captain. It takes sustained injustice to push them beyond the threshold. Hermione's crew did not plan rebellion overnight. Mutiny in the Royal Navy was a capital crime, and stories of severe punishment for sedition circulated as much as tales of flogging. But discontent breeds conversation. On that ship, whispering began in messes below deck and in the dark lantern-lit corners of the forecastle. Men compared files of bad memories, instances where a strapping seaman was struck down for a minor lapse, where a midshipman's future was ruined by a captain's caprice. In such a climate, rumors can mutate into plans. Men traded tales of officers who would be targeted, of ships where similar unrest had been squashed with severity, of the long shadow that a single cruel commander can cast. Before the mutiny that would make Hermione infamous, there were episodes of desperation that revealed the moral fog aboard. A midshipman humiliated publicly, a sailor repeatedly flogged for a small mistake, the topman pitched headlong from the yards during a storm, then thrown overboard as if convenience had met punishment. Each episode narrowed the space for lawful redress. The Navy had courts-martial, and officers could be censured, but when the system is the very instrument that enables cruelty, when promotions are served by nepotism, and when a captain's word is final aboard his ship, formal channels can seem useless to the men underfoot. Consider the perspective of a common sailor on Hermione. He wakes to the sound of orders, to the same rations, the same damp hammocks. He has seen a mate lashed and hears the captain laugh in the wardroom afterward. He saw 3 topmen fall and their bodies go overboard, and he heard nothing that resembled mourning. He has 2 options. He can suppress his outrage, swallow it, and continue to serve under a man who will, at any time, render him vulnerable to arbitrary punishment. Or he can do something else, something dangerous, irretrievable, violent.
That is the human calculus that led to the events soon to be recounted. You should know, too, that the problem wasn't unique to Pigott. The Royal Navy of the age sanctioned flogging. It was part of a disciplinary culture that prized visible correction as a means to maintain order. But Hermione's record, 85 floggings under Pigott alone, stands out. The number indicates excess, yes, but also a pattern. Punishment as an end in itself, rather than a last resort. Where flogging is used as a signal and spectacle, it ceases to reform and becomes a means to humiliate. A crew subjected to such treatment learns to mistrust, not just the officer responsible, but the institution that permits that behavior. Small acts of favoritism, the thin laughter in the wardroom, the captain's indulgence of a particular petty officer, all of them are mortar in the wall between leadership and crew. They don't sound like the ingredients of tragedy when you list them individually, but collect enough of them, present them in situ, at sea, where men cannot walk away, where choices are constrained, and a different picture emerges, a ship where justice is absent and where personal dignity is a casualty. This is not merely historical theater. My own time in uniform taught me that the human dynamics are remarkably constant. I can see a modern equivalent in a barracks, a company office, a command post, a boss who weaponizes discipline to instill fear, a team that opts for silence rather than confrontation because the system is stacked against speaking truth, a culture where abuse is rationalized as necessary for order. The details differ. No one is flogging in most modern forces, but the moral chemistry is the same. Abuse begets resentment. Resentment, unchecked, breeds desperate answers. Back on Hermione, the accumulation of affronts moved the crew from simmering complaint toward planning. There were men who argued it was better to endure, others who thought action unavoidable. Those conversations, once they crossed into plotting, changed everything. Men who had been trained to obey began to apply that training to a different end, coordinated action against an authority they no longer trusted. You can understand why. You can understand the logic without endorsing the outcome. And then came the practicalities. Organizing out of sight of officers on a man of war was a perilous undertaking. Sailors had to arrange signals, choose who among them would act and when. They had to reconcile the fear of being caught with the fear of continued abuse. One misstep could mean punishment or death. But in that perilous encirclement, planning happened. There were factions. Some wanted to seize the armory, others to detain the officers. There were debates about who should live and who should die if it came to that. Tension thickened until inevitably a decision pressed in. Before the flash passes, let me ask you something. What's the worst leader you've served under?
One line, in the comments, no novel required. You don't need to be a sailor to understand Hermione's story. Maybe you had a supervisor who made a farce of discipline, or an officer who punished bravely but unfairly. If that one line helps you place yourself in the shoes of a sailor watching his shipmates fall, it will help make sense of the human forces at work here. It's crucial to underline, what the Hermione crew eventually did was not lawful, and it involved violent murders. That reality should never be washed over or romanticized. Revenge and extrajudicial violence leave lasting stains on both the perpetrator and the victim. Still, understanding how a culture of petty cruelty and arbitrary power can create the conditions for such a rupture is essential if you're trying to learn from history rather than merely to gawk at it. The story of Hermione does not stop at the squall or the pitch of the 3 bodies into the sea. It keeps moving.
through a night when men met in secret, through decisions made under the pressure of fear and anger, through the execution of a plan that would rock the naval world. But before we get to those final brutal hours, it's worth staying a moment longer with the details that made the violence possible. Leadership failures are not usually flash events, they're patterns. Pigot's nepotism insulated him from the ordinary checks that might have reined in a temper that turned to public wrath. The administrative culture of the Navy allowed officers broad latitude, which, absent accountability, can become the latitude to harm. The rank and file, meanwhile, had no easy recourse. Courts-martials awaited, yes, but these were slow and often inaccessible to men who had to live in the same cramped quarters as their oppressor, and so resentment metastasized. There are also structural ironies to note. The ship at sea is the archetype of hierarchy. Orders descend, action ascends. In such a system, the person at the top can be the arbiter of life and death and the interpreter of justice. That concentration of power can be a force for coordination in battle and for cruelty in peace. When abused, it transforms a professional fighting force into a mechanism of repression. Hermione's record, the series of beatings and humiliations, and Pigot's particular temperament mattered because of that structure. His choices had immediate consequences for the men who had no means to elect a new leader, no ballot box, no union. When people live under a system where bad conduct by a superior is tolerated or rewarded, they do not necessarily become better soldiers, they become survivors. Survival strategies vary. Some become sycophants, others become quiet saboteurs, and a few turn to open revolt. You may ask at this point whether the Navy's central administration bore any responsibility. It did, not just for Pigot's indecisive promotion, which was linked to patronage, but for a culture that allowed the lash to function as a primary means of order.
Historians trace how incidents like Hermione's eventual catastrophe contributed to a slow rethinking of discipline in the decades that followed. The lash did not disappear overnight, nor did the culture that enabled it. But the scandal and the attention it drew sparked debates about oversight, about the balance between necessary harshness and human dignity. Institutional reform often follows catastrophe. Learning, regrettably, is too often expensive. For the men on Hermione, reform was abstract and distant. Their immediate world was the deck under their feet, the captain's temper, and the unrelieved dread that another lash could follow any misstep. In that short, brutal orbit, their options narrowed until the only course that felt available was a dangerous one. The scene is set now for what follows: clandestine meetings, a plan hatched under lantern light, the moment when men who had sworn to obey turned that oath into something else entirely, the moment when betrayal in the captain's hands sat like a stone in the belly of the crew and had to be answered. When we return to the next phase of the story, we'll need to look closely at intent, at the moral choices made in the heat of a midnight decision. We'll need to hold both the captain accountable for his pattern of cruelty and the mutineers accountable for choosing violence. For now, the ship waits. The rigging still sings in the wind. The men of Hermione have crossed a threshold in their thinking. The rest is a terrible human calculus that will test legality, morality, and the fragility of order at sea. They met in the dark, below the waterline where the lanterns burned low and officers' boots were least likely to be heard. It began with whispers, fragments of outrage passed from man to man. Names of the repeatedly flogged, the midshipmen who had been stripped of rank, the topmen pitched from the yards and tossed into the sea. Those whispers hardened into decisions, the way cold makes a fracture, slow at first, then suddenly unitary and dangerous. Organizing a mutiny aboard a man-of-war was not as simple as raising a banner. It required timing, secrecy, trust among men who had been taught to obey and who had been taught to fear betraying one another. There were signals, simple things that made sense at sea: a knock pattern at the hatch, the placement of a bucket by the starboard rail, the calloused hand left unwashed so a friend would know the bearer. Men volunteered for tasks with the silent calculation that once the deed began, there would be no turning back. They debated targets and methods. Some argued for seizure of the ship and a clean escape to land. Others wanted the officers confined and sent ashore to face the law. A small but violent faction argued that the men who had been instruments of Pigot's cruelty, those whom the crew saw as his enforcers, should not be left alive. The plan they settled on was brutal and swift.
It hinged on catching the officers unarmed and off guard in the first hours before sunrise, when the ship was quieter and the watch less alert. Men assigned to the yards and the forecastle would take vantage points. Others would secure the main deck and cut off escape routes. They kept weapons close at hand: boarding pikes, belaying pins, knives hidden in sleeves. The armory would be a prize if they could take it. A secured armory would mean total control. There was no pretense of lawful procedure in their plotting, only the desperate arithmetic of men who believed they had already been failed by law. When it happened, it was sudden. One moment the hush of night and the sway of the sea, the next a burst of movement as hatches opened and the murmur of coordinated shouts rose. Men who had changed sails and swabbed decks together now moved as hostile cells. Officers taken in their cabins had little chance. The door at the captain's cabin went first. Captain Hugh Piggott was dragged into the light, overwhelmed by bodies and brute force. Contemporary accounts and later depositions make the sequence clear enough without dwelling on the exactitude of every blow. Piggott was beaten, bound, and then, with hands that had once signed punishment orders, thrown over the rail into the sea. The ship that had been under his strict command witnessed his end. What followed was neither tidy justice nor a liberating uprising. In the flooding brightness of dawn, a macabre, fevered session of reckoning rolled through the decks. Men formed rough tribunals, kangaroo courts led by the very people who had been crushed by Piggott's regime. Decisions were made in minutes. Some officers were dragged from their bunks and killed. Lieutenant McIntosh, the Marine commander, an officer whose name recurs in accounts of the episode, was among those murdered. Others were left alive, bound and set adrift. Some had their hands and faces marked in humiliation. The mutineers disposed of the bodies of several officers by throwing them overboard. It was a violent, chaotic sequence in which anger and calculation commingled. There are several things to hold in your mind about those hours. First, brutal violence is not the same as righteousness. The men who carried out the murders had been abused, humiliated, and frightened. Many believed they were avenging necessary wrongs. Yet what they did was premeditated murder. It is a moral line to cross, and crossing it leaves deep scars not just on victims, but on whole institutions, on sailors who must live with the consequences, and on a navy that must respond. Second, the mutineers were selective in their violence. They spared some officers, killed others, and found ways to rationalize choices after the fact, often blaming individual officers rather than taking a full-eyed responsibility for the breach of law. That rationalization is part of the human way of making bloodshed bearable.
After the killings, Hermione's crew did something that transformed their crime into a geopolitical scandal. They sold the ship. To adjacent Spanish authorities or merchants, accounts differ on some details. They turned over Hermione for coin and sanctuary. The sale of a British frigate to a foreign power was not merely theft. In the climate of the Revolutionary Wars, it was treasonous. The men who had mutinied and then sold the ship had crossed the line from desperate insurrection to an act that undercut the very nation many of them had once served. For a time, some of the mutineers thought they had bought themselves freedom. They scattered, trying to dissolve into port cities or find refuge aboard other ships. A few tried to vanish ashore and take up ordinary work, but the Royal Navy and the state did not let the incident pass. News of Hermione's mutiny traveled fast. The loss of a frigate, the murder of officers, the sale to the Spanish. These were indignities the Admiralty could not ignore. A widespread manhunt followed. British naval and civil authorities cooperated to track down the participants. Intelligence circulated across the Caribbean and back to Britain. Some mutineers were captured swiftly. Others were detained months later after being identified by survivors or through naval informants. The enforcement was resolute. At least 33 of the supposed perpetrators were eventually seized and returned to face British justice. The trials were solemn and severe. In total, 24 of those captured were hanged, the decision sent as a chilling message about the costs of mutiny and piracy. The executions were public and deliberate, a stage set not only for punishment, but for deterrence. They were not mere retributive spectacle. They were a statement by a naval system that violence against officers and the betrayal of a ship's commission could not be normalized. Still, the hangings themselves left questions hanging in the air. Did public executions restore order, or did they obscure the real institutional failures that allowed a captain to push his men to such extremes? The legal response answered the crime, but did not, by itself, cure the systemic ills that had made it possible. It's important to acknowledge individual fates amid the mass. David O'Brien Casey, the midshipman who had been flogged and demoted, survived the mutiny and its aftermath. He would later rise in rank, becoming lieutenant, and continue his career in the Royal Navy. To some, his survival and promotion are a bitter irony. He had been publicly humiliated by the man who would be murdered by other men in desperate revolt. To others, Casey's later advancement speaks to the confusing moral texture of the event. A man wronged by a captain survives a mutiny and continues to serve the same institution that abandoned him to humiliation. The threads are knotty and resist tidy moral conclusions.
Another name that surfaces in accounts is Michael Sheehy, a seaman known to have been repeatedly flogged under Piggott. His repeated corporal punishment exemplifies the cumulative cruelty that made mutiny imaginable. Put these threads together, and you see a broad pattern. Certain officers used the lash with abandon. Certain men bore the lash until their outrage exceeded their fear, and once the line was crossed, the results were violent and irreversible. The Hermione affair had reverberations beyond the immediate executions and the sale of the frigate. It became, in Britain and in naval circles, a cautionary tale. Parliamentary inquiries, press commentaries, and naval dispatches debated what had happened and why. Reformers seized on Hermione as evidence that existing disciplinary practices could be abused, and abused they had been. The statistic of 85 floggings during Pickett's command became shorthand for a captain who weaponized corporal punishment. Critics used the case to argue not for the abolition of discipline — naval service required order and often severe measures — but for stricter oversight, clearer limits, and better mechanisms for officers to be reported and investigated. Change came slowly. The lash would remain a tool of naval discipline for many years. Reformers had to fight culture as well as regulation. But Hermione's notoriety helped broaden the conversation about what was acceptable. The case was cited in debates over judicial processes within the Navy, the proper scope of captain's authority, and the need for officers to be held to standards of judgment when giving orders that endangered life. The reform was incremental, but the outrage helped shift the center of gravity in naval policy discourse toward greater accountability. Even as institutions debated reforms, the human cost remained immediate and raw. Families mourned officers who would never return. Sailors who had been part of the mutiny lived with the consequences, some pitted down by executions, others haunted by acts they could not undo. The Admiralty's punitive measures were thorough. They were meant not merely to punish, but to reassert the rule of law over lawlessness. That reassertion had to contend with the fact that cruelty at sea had been both normal and excessively normal in many commanding environments. Punishing mutineers did not unmake the culture that had spawned the mutiny. There is also a broader lesson about the moral exposure of leadership in contexts that concentrate power. A captain at sea is not a manager in a benign office. He is in many ways a small state's executive officer. His orders can save a ship or doom it. When that power is coupled with resentment, entitlement, and a willingness to humiliate, the results are corrosive. The Hermione story shows that leaders who treat punishment as personal entertainment or a tool for self-aggrandizement risk turning loyalty into hatred.
They create environments where lawful redress seems futile and extra-legal solutions appear as the only remaining option. None of this absolves the mutineers. Their crimes — murder, selling the frigate, treachery — inflicted harm beyond the men who had condemned them. Extrajudicial violence and betrayal of national trust carry heavy moral and legal weight. The mutineers became criminals in the eyes of the law, and, in many respects, the architects of their own ruin. The narrative resists simple heroes and villains. Cruelty bred cruelty. Lawlessness begot law's harsh reply. Both leader and followers share culpability, but at different registers and with different consequences. I keep returning to the personal, because history here is not an abstraction. I think of faces on those decks. I imagine the man who had cleaned rigging since he was a boy, the midshipman's quiet pride when he learned a new knot, the marine whose job it was to keep order. Each of them had a life outside the microcosm of the ship, a set of hopes and fears that the lash could not erase. When a leader treats those lives as instruments rather than as colleagues, the social contract breaks. From my own service, where the worst punishments were administrative, where a sergeant could embarrass you but not bind you with a rope, I've seen how quickly discipline can be turned into petty theater. I remember First Sergeant Bravo, an old hand who understood the difference between pushing men to perform and making them afraid. He used to say, half in jest and half in warning, that a leader's power is like a bayonet, useful in the right hand, deadly in the wrong one. He watched a new lieutenant once drive a squad into an extended drill, not to teach, but to publicly display his authority. The men performed, they left resentful. Over time, Bravo told me, that lieutenant learned that obedience bought by humiliation was brittle. He lost respect, he lost cohesion. That kind of loss looks small on a report sheet, but it is the seedbed of something worse. The Hermione affair is precisely the kind of something worse. It is the extreme case that shows what can happen when petty cruelty is left to accumulate. Leaders seldom intend to create mutiny. Most of them set out to maintain order, but the line between maintaining order and abusing authority can be crossed, and crossing it changes the moral economy of command.
There's another angle worth considering, the institutional responsibility that allowed a captain like Pigott to rise in the first place. Patronage and nepotism were not accidental features of 18th century Britain. They were mechanisms of social reproduction. They promoted favoritism in appointments and insulated officers from scrutiny. When promotion springs from connections rather than capability, the risk of misfit in high office increases. This is not a problem limited to old navies. Modern organizations that reward loyalty over merit sow the same seeds.
The Hermione story therefore reads in part as a warning about the structural enablers that allow bad leaders to accumulate unchecked power. So what are the lessons, measured and humble, that survive from Hermione? First, accountability matters. Systems must have mechanisms by which those in command can be questioned, evaluated, and, if necessary, removed. Second, discipline that humiliates is not discipline that reforms, it corrodes. Punishment should be proportionate, transparent, and aimed at restoring order and capability, not degrading dignity. Third, voice and redress channels must exist. Men on Hermione had, in many cases, no meaningful way to air grievances. When institutional channels are blocked, people look for other means. Fourth, leaders must be trained not only in tactics and seamanship, but in moral judgment and restraint. The ability to balance authority with humanity is a crucial skill, and it is learned, not given. And yet, warnings can be misread as absolution. The mutineers, no matter the provocations, chose murder and treachery. That choice inflicted lasting wounds. History must judge both leader and perpetrator without condoning either side. The moral landscape is uneven, but the ethical standards remain clear. Fomenting or engaging in extrajudicial killing is wrong. Abusing authority is also wrong. The tragedy of Hermione is that it forced both these wrongs into violent collision. In the years that followed the scandal, Navy men and legislators debated and eventually acted. Reforms would creep in, limits on flogging, an increasing sensitivity towards the abuse of command, a slow recognition that the machinery of discipline had to be tempered by conscience and legal oversight. Those reforms were born in part from outrage and in part from fear. Fear that without change, more Hermiones would happen. Institutional learning often arrives late and weighs heavy. Hermione helped push that learning forward. There are contemporary parallels beyond the obvious. I do not mean to sound alarmist about modern command and control. Most contemporary militaries have far greater oversight and civil controls than the Royal Navy of the 1790s, but culture persists. Leaders who elevate spectacle over substance, who confuse personal authority with moral right, create environments where trust thins and resentment grows. A junior officer today who publicly shames a subordinate for a trivial mistake creates a ripple. Those ripples, if ignored, join to form currents that can sweep whole units into dysfunction. Leadership, in its best form, is stewardship. It protects the people under command, gives them purpose, and restrains itself in the exercise of power. If the Hermione story has a final chord, it is a summons to humility. A leader's authority is a sacred trust, not a license for cruelty. Those entrusted with command must take up that trust with a clear eye to justice and to the human dignity of those they lead.
Followers, too, have duties: to speak when they can, to use institutional channels, and to beware of the corrosive attractiveness of vengeance. Both sides are bound to a moral web. Tearing it damages everyone. I said at the beginning I'd ask you for a single line in the comments about the worst leader you ever served under. Consider this the final moment to reflect on why that matters. Tell a brief story. No novel, just a sentence. It helps us understand how small humiliations mount, and why a ship like Hermione could reach its terrible terminus. And if this history struck you, if it made you think twice about the weight of command, about the costs of humiliation, about how fragile loyalty can be, please subscribe and share. Share it with someone who leads or someone who follows. Ask them to think about the small cruelties they may have tolerated. Tell us in the comments a one-line account of a leader who changed your life, whether for the better or worse. The past has a way of teaching us if we're willing to listen. The story of Hermione is brutal and uncomfortable, but it is a truth worth holding. Betrayal at the hands of someone you trusted is not just a personal wrong, it can be a harbinger of disaster.